May it please the court, Mr. Pruner, Mr. Moody. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of Joshua Rosa for your patience and your attentiveness throughout the course of this week's most serious trial. My job, Mr. Pruner's job, is almost over, but the bulk of your job still remains. Not that the beginning and throughout this week hasn't been important, but it is your decision based on viewing the facts in this case and applying the law that our jury system is all about. This is an opportunity for me to speak to you about what this case is all about. As you know, and as the judge will instruct you, what Mr. Pruner says and what I say is not evidence. Lawyers persuade. Evidence, the only true evidence, is what you've heard from the witness stand, coupled with the documentary evidence and the exhibits that you will have back with you that have been admitted throughout the trial. That is evidence. You are the triers of fact. And as Mr. Pruner said, not every potential speculation, not only what the court referred to as the true facts, but apply them as instructed to the law. This was a horrible, senseless death. In our rush to do Stephen Tomlinson justice, we have to step back and analyze what's been given to us to determine the innocence or guilt of Joshua Rosa. As I told you in opening statement, the state's case relies very heavily on your belief in circumstantial evidence. Let's talk about direct and circumstantial evidence a little bit. Direct evidence is evidence that tends to prove a fact in question in a case without the necessity to rely on the inference of proof from another fact. Circumstantial evidence is evidence that, first, is relevant, and two, is of the quality that leads to an inference that an event did or did not take place. And as I've told you, and as I still believe very strongly, they are double-edged swords. What are the facts? You've heard over the course of this week, the first witness that we heard from was Cherie Tomlinson, and Cherie Tomlinson is Stephen Tomlinson's sister. What we heard from Cherie Tomlinson was that Stephen got off the bus that day at approximately 4:30 or thereabouts, and they walked home. She talked about the fact that her brother, Ronnie, had moved from Georgia the previous week, or moved to Georgia the previous week, based largely because of the fact that he was continually getting in trouble and there were problems. There were problems in the neighborhood. Kids were trying to jump him. There had been another incident a couple of months back that actually involved Cherie Tomlinson to the extent where the family got involved. There was an issue in the yard. There was some threats made. There was some damage done to property. And certainly when you consider the evidence, it's your job to consider all that might have been in play and all that might conceivably be part and parcel of the death of Stephen Tomlinson. Cherie Tomlinson told you that on the 8th of December, she was at home that afternoon, and she told you that Joshua Rosa came to the house? Well, in considering whether Joshua Rosa came to the house, it's inevitable that what you need to also consider is that Cherie Tomlinson gave a statement to Detective Lewis just 2 days after the incident occurred. 2 days after the death of Stephen Tomlinson. That statement was recorded. She was asked to tell them on tape, what do you know? What happened? What happened that day? And she never told Detective Lewis that Joshua Rosa came to that house. And you need to ask yourself, if you're going to rely in any way, shape, or form upon that statement, why, in what was going on, so important, how that inevitably, seriously important fact was left out of a recorded conversation with the detective who was investigating this crime. And what further concerns should we have with regard to that statement? Well, this random visit by Joshua Rosa that day, Kevin Whiteley, if you remember, talked about coming there after work and staying at the Tomlinson's house for approximately 45 minutes in the kitchen. Never, and keep in mind some time frame here, folks. You know, we got to understand that Stephen Tomlinson got home from 4:30. We have to understand that that he went to take a bike ride and he came back again, and try to align that during the time that Kevin Whiteley was in that house in the kitchen, able to see and hear everything that was going on, he says Joshua Rosa didn't come by. Now, Mr. Pruner said, well, could he have come by at a time you weren't there? Well, I guess he could have. He could have come by at 9 in the morning, or he could have come by at noon. But certainly, as it's relevant to your consideration, it's a problem. Kevin Whiteley also, who, by the way, is a soft-spoken young man, attempted to recall the 8th of December, 05 for you. Remember, he corroborated the various problems that Ronnie was having with people. Remember that he was practically living with the Tomlinsons at that time because of some transportation problems. Actually, for the preceding 3 or 4 months, he was a regular, a frequent member of the Tomlinson family. He doesn't know Joshua Rosa. Joshua Rosa doesn't know him, although he had seen Joshua Rosa a couple of times on the street. Never at the house, by the way, in that 4-month period. Asked him, you ever seen him at the house? No. He told you that he hadn't seen Stephen Tomlinson and Joshua Rosa together. In fact, recall that although the state would have you believe that Joshua Rosa was a mentor to Stephen Tomlinson in the Royal Rangers, that's not what was said. What was said clearly is that he went to church with the Rosa family a couple of times almost a year prior. That was the extent of the relationship as it relates to church. It was not the relationship that the state would have you believe. Stephen Whiteley then proceeded to tell you a little bit about what happened that day. He talked about the park. He talked about how it's a common place for people to go and smoke marijuana and drink. That he and Fabian Fliss and Juan Rivera got in the car and started to go back there at that time. And let's recall what else he told you. He first tells you he sees Joshua Rosa as they go to the park. He calls it dusk. He says that on more than one occasion. We have established that on December 8th, by way of a stipulation, that at 5:35 was sunset. Certainly we all know by our everyday common experiences that sunset is not dark, that there's lots of light for lots of time after sunset. That is a formal name given by the Bureau, the Weather Bureau, and various armed forces agencies. Use your daily experiences to deduct and consider that when we talk about sunset. He sees Joshua Rosa coming from the woods. In his words, from this area here at red, and you're going to have this back to look at, and I ask you to look at it in total and look at it as you survey the scene and the area and what proposes to happen in the next hour. Ladies and gentlemen, if Joshua Rosa had murdered Stephen Tomlinson, would he run frantically directly to a car? Begging, literally begging for someone to help, to give him a cell phone. There's somebody hurt back there. Now, of course not, the answer would be. Now, Mr. Pruner has told you that he had concealment. Well, he already had concealment. He didn't need concealment. If he needed concealment, he would have stayed in the woods. Look at this place. If you committed a murder, you think you might be able to find somewhere to go? If you wanted to conceal yourself from sight? If you wanted to conceal yourself from any knowledge that you had been involved in a crime? I would suggest to you that if Joshua Rosa was seeking to conceal himself, then it certainly didn't make sense to do what he did. He could have escaped undetected in the manner in which this area is laid out. Much has been said, and you will hear more, I'm sure, from Mr. Pruner about Joshua Rosa not mentioning or not saying Stephen Tomlinson's name when asked. Well, again, I want you to consider and I want you to think about what the circumstances are. And it certainly, you know, it's not an acknowledgement of a crime. I can tell you that. I want you to consider what happened as that was going on. Joshua Rosa had just found the body of someone severely injured. Forget that he knew Stephen Tomlinson for a second. He's frantic, he's scared, it's chaotic. All of those words are used by various witnesses and various people that testify in this case. All those words at varying times. And if they can all be used at varying times by varying witnesses, then they can certainly all be used in the same sentence. He runs directly to a group of strangers who don't know him and who he doesn't know. He doesn't know they know Stephen Tomlinson, or whether they do or whether they don't. And quite frankly, it's easily understood why under those circumstances he doesn't take the time to be concerned about who it is, what the identity is. There are other serious matters at hand, and that's the life of Stephen Tomlinson at that point in time. Because, as you know, and as we've heard, Stephen Tomlinson was alive, certainly at the point when Josh Rosa was there, because, in fact, he was alive when they went back there, and that was some little bit of time later. It's not evidence of culpability. It's evidence of his need to retrieve help. Kevin Whiteley then tracks the scene where he runs back to the area and finds the bike and finds the body with Josh Rosa behind him. And at that point in time, after the hysteria that has begun in the neighborhood, people starting to come behind them. He told you that Mr. Rosa was scared. Again, he was frantic. He asked at one point to go home to get his dad. But even as he did that, and even as they were screaming at him and threatening him, he continued to say, "I did not do this. I did not kill him." It even got to the point where Kevin Whiteley told you that he told him, "I'll lay you down here next to Stephen." So consider the hysteria at this particular time in that park. He knelt next to Kevin Whiteley. Kevin Whiteley pulled up the shirt. He checked for a heartbeat. Mr. Rosa held his head. He helped Mr. Whiteley in any manner he needed at that stage of the game, because he had taken himself back from being any responder further than that, especially because of the circumstances that were going on at that particular time. And what does Kevin Whiteley tell you? He tells you that Stephen tried to run, Joshua Rosa tried to run, and he was tackled. At that stage of the game, Poppy, who is Mr. Rivera Sr., was on his way there along with several other people, and Mr. Rivera holds him at that location, and the next thing you know, that fire rescue comes to begin their help concerning Stephen Tomlinson. The first thing he said is, "I didn't do this." Kevin Whiteley testified that he tried to help Stephen, pulled up his shirt, lifted it up close to his face, lifted him off of the ground and put him back down again. And the state would have you believe that he should have some blood on him. It's the insinuation, and I suspect Mr. Bruner will talk to you about, well, why doesn't he have blood on him like Mr. Rosa does? If he also helped, and if Mr. Rosa didn't do much while Kevin Whiteley was there, which was Kevin Whiteley's testimony. Well, first, the full extent of any assistance rendered hasn't been fully established. We're in a situation where at that stage of the game, the blood that is on the body of Joshua Rosa at those various places are absolutely explainable. And we'll talk exclusively and extensively about that a little bit later on. Secondly, nobody did any Castlemeyer presumptive blood testing on Kevin Whiteley to determine how many places of blood existed on his clothing that you couldn't see, because certainly the majority of the blood that existed on Joshua Rosa's pants is not visual to the eye. The blood that exists on the gloves and on his hand. The only place that was bleeding on Stephen Tomlinson was the nose and the mouth. Please look at the pictures, all of them, before you rely on one particular picture to help you determine this particular circumstance. Because several of these pictures are clear that not only does Stephen Tomlinson have blood on his face, but it's very clear that the blood has been wiped in several areas. In essence, Kevin Whiteley gave you a true picture of the unbelievable emotion and the chaos that was taking place at that scene on December 8th, 2005. And his testimony supports the extent of Joshua Rosa's involvement at that time. Next, we heard from Javier Bassano, who was the neighbor of Joshua Rosa, and essentially he testifies together a couple of times previously. No large extent of that relationship, at least not regularly. The significant, or the alleged significance of his testimony is that he said that sometime before he left to go out on December 8th, 2005, sometime after 6 o'clock, Joshua Rosa asked him if he had seen Stephen. The major problem with that, ladies and gentlemen, for your consideration, is that he never said it until months and months later. Ladies and gentlemen, that has to be startling, because here again, we're in a situation where on December 8th, detectives were canvassing this neighborhood and the 9th, at which time Javier Bassano gave his statement, and they're not out there for their health. They're there to find out what happened. They're there to find out what people know. They're not coming up and saying, hey, look, were you around? Okay, fine, see you later. Okay? That's not what happens. What happens is they go to him and they say, what do you know? What do you see? Now, keep in mind that Javier Bassano already knows that there's been a homicide. He already knows the next day that Stephen Tomlinson is dead. He already knows that everybody in the neighborhood is accusing Joshua Rosa. Well, you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to know that when somebody asks you what happened and what do you know about this, if you saw the guy who is alleged to have committed the murder asking about the person who is the victim, you would tell the police. Could there be any more important information that Javier Bassano could have given on December 9th, 2005? I don't think so. We next heard from Deputy Perez, and Deputy Perez was the first law enforcement agency on the scene, officer on the scene. Deputy Perez tells you that, in fact, when he got there, it was chaos. He got there, he said everyone was irate, that they were threatening to beat him, and in fact, he was seeking their security. He was seeking the security of the police in order to keep them away. At that point in time, Joshua Rosa tells him, they think I did this. And he also says, I didn't do it, I found him. Well, at that point in time, Deputy Perez, in an abundance of caution, takes and leaves Joshua Rosa uncuffed, in a police car, not restrained, not under arrest. Certainly with time, if in fact the gloves were going to be any issue whatsoever as an instrument of a murder, as opposed to an instrument of help, that he could have stuffed them somewhere, he could have dropped them somewhere, he could have put, how many times have you noticed or how many times have you heard where in police vehicles evidence is found? Now, does that suggest to you that it would have been found 2 days later or the next time the car was cleaned? No, of course not. And that's not what I'm asking you to infer. What I'm telling you is the means were there if, in fact, this was an instrument of murder. What else Deputy Perez tells you that is extremely important is he tells you that when he does ask Joshua Rosa for what is in his pockets or whatever the terminology was. Joshua Rosa goes into his pocket with his own hand, pulls out 2 gloves that have blood on them and nail clippers in the same hand. And we'll talk a little later about the significance of that. And you know where I'm going. We're talking about sensitive stuff. We're talking about science. Okay? But I want you to recall that Deputy Perez said that they came out of the same pocket. Now, what's also important is not only did the clippers and the gloves come out of the same pocket, but the gloves went back in the pocket again with the same hand, back into the pocket again of the running pants, the nylon running pants. And that's where they stayed until Corporal Pilley. Corporal Pilley testified that when he heard that Joshua had some gloves, he wanted them. So what happens? He goes and he asks for them. Joshua Rosa puts his hand back in his pocket again, and he brings out the wadded up white gloves, and he gives them to Detective Pilley, Corporal Pilley. The other thing that Corporal Pilley says is that he, when he goes back to the area where the body is, he finds a set of keys with an Alonzo keychain or medallion on it in plain view near the buttock of Stephen Tomlinson. Well, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't surprise me because Joshua Rosa was there. He was there at the body of Stephen Tomlinson. You know, this is not an identity case of who was at the body of Stephen Tomlinson. Joshua Rosa was at the body of Stephen Tomlinson. We then heard from Juan Rivera Sr., and Juan Rivera Sr. testified that his role in this case was that he, number one, called 911, and in addition to that, obviously, he corroborates that Joshua Rosa ran screaming to his house, begging to call 911 and begging for help. Certainly not the emotions of a killer. Certainly, as Mr. Pruner would suggest, I think way an overplay of somebody who was trying to make the best of a worse situation. Especially when there are several other witnesses that corroborate this despair, this fright, this constant request to try to garner help in that short period of time. He also tells you that he's getting dark when Joshua Rosa approaches. He again corroborates screaming and threatening, and Joshua Rosa's repeated statements that he did not kill anybody, he did not hurt anybody. Evidence. Mr. Rivera's testimony, and therefore a conflict in the evidence, and that is because he testified that Joshua Rosa was not tackled, not manhandled, as Kevin Whiteley says. You should consider these conflicts in the evidence as you deliberate. Kevin Whiteley, when asked more than once, assured you by his testimony that that occurred, providing a reasonable explanation amongst other reasonable explanations for the injuries, if you would like to call them injuries, to Joshua Rosa. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. He says he grabs Joshua Rosa to hold him and to keep him from going anywhere, awaiting the fire medics or law enforcement so that they can take him somewhere safe. And in fact says, look, I was concerned about his safety too. Pedro Rivera, who is a neighbor of the Tomlinsons, he doesn't have a watch on the 8th of December 2005, so he doesn't and can't tell us, can't be sure about the times of what he allegedly viewed. He's not exactly sure how dark it is. He says it's fairly dark. He says Stephen Tomlinson was walking down Mondragon to Monterey, followed later by Joshua Rosa carrying a flashlight. Please note that and consider that he doesn't recall until reminded that he had given a previous statement just a couple of hours before, and understanding that he has a language barrier. The first statement taken by a detective in the neighborhood survey was translated to him by his wife, and the time frames with regard to that testimony differ substantially from what he later says to Detective Lewis. As you consider the evidence thus far, ladies and gentlemen, remember that witnesses make mistakes. They are subject to the same human frailties that you and I encounter in everyday life. Faulty memories, faulty recollections, mistaken and misplaced impressions, and certainly over time, things change as well. And those things lead to inaccurate testimony. They lead to holes in the evidence and conflicts in the evidence. And those are all things you should consider when you deliberate. The last lay witness that testified was Fabian Fliss. Mr. Fliss did his best to try to recollect the circumstances leading up to the park and the incident in the park. He talked about how the trip to the park took place. He didn't really want any part of helping initially, obviously, because they had some contraband in the car, and he didn't want to be associated with that contraband. So they essentially left Joshua Rosa, turned around and left, intending to not participate, intending not to help in any way, shape, or form. But what they did do was they told Joshua Rosa to go to the Rivera house, which he did. He ran directly there. He told you that Joshua Rosa told him, "There's a kid hurt back there." He recalled that Joshua Rosa asked him to get in the car, and he declined. And then again, he, as Kevin Whiteley, talks about the path that Joshua Rosa takes from the woods. I again would urge you to consider the same argument I made to you, a very credible argument, as to why that is inaccurate and why it's doubtful that that took place. But what adds and should add to your speculation about Mr. Fliss's testimony is that he said that the flashlight flickered or the flashlight was on inside the woods. But as he was questioned further, and as he was asked to recollect what he had previously said in a sworn statement, he told you that what he said at that time was that the flashlight flicked on when he came out of the woods. Well, you know, you may turn away and say, well, you know, so what? Well, but it's not so what. It's so what because you have to make a determination based on what you hear, what is credible. And in fact, that he changed his story and that it was significant in nature because, quite frankly, where Josh Rosa comes from is an important fact. But what he does say is that he ran directly to the car, he sought their help, and he sought it immediately, unequivocally, and without hesitation. I don't believe that's thinking on your feet, ladies and gentlemen. And I don't think the evidence will show you that. When he does arrive at the park, and remember he's last, so some of what goes on there is not contemplated in his testimony, he again talks about yelling and Joshua Rosa's fright. He tells you and gives you another piece to the puzzle when he talks about during the yelling and the asking, how did you find him? Joshua Rosa tells them he had been jogging. And so, therefore, consider the consistency of the fact that the testimony is that he jogs regularly. Remember again, Fabian Fliss doesn't know Joshua Rosa. Joshua Rosa doesn't know Fabian Fliss. And as importantly, neither of them know that the other knows Stephen Tomlinson. And that's important if you're going to suggest that there is some underlying motive for murder that would keep Joshua Rosa from giving that name. And again, apply the previous argument I've made about the reasonable circumstances that exist in that situation. We got to the back half of the week after our lay testimony, and we were inundated with expert testimony, which is certainly different. Creates a different mentality in listening to, and certainly creates a different mentality in discerning. Mr. Pruner suggested that this is not a case of expert witnesses, but it's a case of common sense, and I would only respond by saying the state put on 5 expert witnesses. So you consider its importance in their eyes. A variety, though, of very important issues, no matter who puts them on. I would ask you to remember that science is infallible. Excuse me, that's not what I wanted to say. Science is fallible. Science is not exact. And regardless of how sometimes it sounds very impressive on its face, expert testimony is admitted only for the purpose of aiding you in arriving to a conclusion. You're not bound by any of the opinions of the experts that you heard this week. You should consider all of the evidence in this case, and in resolving any conflicts that you may have with the testimony of experts such as Dr. Krastowski and Dr. Wright, although they agree on some things, consider the reasons for their opinions and the facts and the other matters upon which those opinions are based. We heard from Paulito Bertos on 2 different occasions, and she's a crime scene analyst from FDLE. She processed the right shoe 1 in 240 quadrillion that it belongs to Stephen Tomlinson. Well, you could be pretty sure these numbers aren't so bad, because there's a good reason for it. Joshua Rosa was there, and Joshua Rosa was at the body, and Joshua Rosa was in that park attempting to help Stephen Tomlinson. And don't miss the ball. Kevin Whiteley's testimony of what Joshua Rosa did, that the state would have you rely on to determine, well, how else could the blood get there, doesn't encompass what happened before Kevin Whiteley got there. You should expect to find a swipe of blood on this tennis shoe under the circumstances that existed and the contact with Stephen Tomlinson's body. Remember also, in talking about our expert witnesses, what's been said about transfers. That gloves to shoes, Scott Henderson, sure, very possible. Small amounts on the blood, of blood on the ground, well, I know that Tex Sackman looked for blood in a grid so many feet from the body. But one thing you should know from science is that as much of the evidence is in this case as it relates to blood with Joshua Rosa, you can't see it. And therefore, you don't always see it. So it doesn't always mean it's not there. So also remember that the only injury Stephen Tomlinson that bleeds is the nose and the mouth. And Dr. Wright told you that the volume of blood under those circumstances is very small. But blood goes a long way. Paulina Bertos analyzed the black pants and all of those Castlemeyer presumptive stains, and we now know that presumptive means presence of, and certainly additional serology is done in these circumstances because the presumption of blood isn't blood until serology is done. It turns pink if there's the presence of blood. And also, what you learned is that it reacts to other substances. It reacts to vegetable substances. It reacts to cobalts. It reacts to certain things in detergents. Consider all those things when you decide whether those black pants had 20 some odd places on them that had blood, from a nose that bleeds 2 tablespoons, and consider whether or not that volume of blood can cover the clothing that exists on Stephen Tomlinson. And Dr. Wright told you, certainly, yes, it can. Few of those stains on those pants were visible. I encourage you, when you deliberate, because of the kind of case this is, put your gloves on. You know, ladies and gentlemen, put your gloves on and look at the evidence. And pull it out and study it and look at it again and compare it to the pictures and compare picture to picture, because you have to do that in order to do this the right way. You know, what Paulina Bertos can't tell us, though, is when any presence of blood, if there was blood, might have gotten there, how any presence of blood, if it was blood, got there, and why is that important? Because, again, I think she thought I was crazy, but this is not a CODIS case. It's not a case where you take a sample from a known victim and you try to compare it with an unknown sample, where you have to put it through a database and say, do we have anybody in America that we know of that's either a convicted felon or that has given blood for any reason that ends up in this national database, to suggest that we can get a match. These were 2 known samples. When she did this testing, these are 2 people that knew each other, that had had contact before. You don't know what they've shared, what they've done, how they've spoken, how they've touched, not only in previous days, but on the 8th of December. What is curious in a scenario like this why, in a mad struggle, in a dynamic situation that Josh Rosa would have, allegedly, with Stephen Tomlinson to his death, is there no blood whatsoever and no injuries remotely consistent with this dynamic situation? There's no blood on the tank top at all, which certainly under the circumstances you would believe, if Josh Rosa was the perpetrator, there would be some type of blood or DNA. You know, you've got DNA in other places that in my mind don't matter, but you don't have it in a place that should matter. What about injuries? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Next, the state brought you another expert, Amy Rockhold. She is a scientist as well. She's works for FDLE, and she dealt primarily with the clippers and the clipping. She took left hand and right hand clippings from Stephen Tomlinson, and she told you she swabbed them all over. So first of all, take right out of your consideration that these swabbings from those clippings came from underneath the fingernail. Now, again, we may be cutting hairs, but guess what? We got to cut hairs. And the question and the reason that's important is because under the fingernails or on top of the fingernails make a lot of difference when you talk about the contact that you have with somebody, right? I mean, if you're talking about under the fingernails, then maybe that suggests that, doesn't automatically suggest, and I'm not certainly telling you there are not 100 other possibilities, but if it's on top of the swab or on bottom of a swab, then certainly you have some focal point to determine how you're going to make your next conclusion. But she took those clippings and she also took the clippers and she did swabbings on those, and she also did the gloves. Well, let's start with the easy part first. The gloves have Stephen Tomlinson's blood on them, and you'll get a chance to see the gloves and look at the gloves and look at the blood and look where it's located. And I ask you to do that, if not once, 10 times. And are we sitting down? 1 in 240 quadrillion. Well, yes, because it's Stephen Tomlinson's blood and because the gloves were used to wipe Stephen Tomlinson's face. So, granted, don't spend any time on that situation in respect to my argument as to why it's there. I have no qualms with DNA as it relates to that piece of evidence. Amy Reinhold. She swabbed the clippings everywhere. No profiles that weren't Stephen Tomlinson were found. So everything in the clippings was Stephen Tomlinson. She found and that was in the right hand. So right hand, Stephen Tomlinson. And, I don't know whether young Stephen had his hand behind his back, but there's no DNA with regard to Stephen Tomlinson on the left hand. On the right hand, there is Stephen Tomlinson again in his own fingernail clippings, but there's also a foreign contributor. And they used everything known to FDLE, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, who does all of the serology for the state of Florida crime, short of it going somewhere else. And it was such a low yield of DNA, she couldn't even find a profile. She couldn't even get a pattern out of it. In fact, what she said is she couldn't make any determination whatsoever regarding the profile. And we asked her, the best of your technology, with everything going over once and going over twice, you weren't able to develop any interpretable evidence as it relates to the clippings on the left side. To another lab to do a do-over or another go-round. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. because she also had the opportunity to deal with the Clippers. Amy Reinhold. She swabbed the clippings everywhere. No profiles that weren't Stephen Tomlinson were found. So everything in the clippings was Stephen Tomlinson. She found and that was in the right hand. So right hand, Stephen Tomlinson. And, you know, I don't know whether young Stephen had his hand behind his back, but there's no DNA with regard to Stephen Tomlinson on the left hand. On the right hand, there is Stephen Tomlinson again in his own fingernail clippings, but there's also a foreign contributor. And they used everything known to FDLE, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, who does all of the serology for the state of Florida crime, short of it going somewhere else. And it was such a low yield of DNA, she couldn't even find a profile. She couldn't even get a pattern out of it. In fact, what she said is she couldn't make any determination whatsoever regarding the profile. And we asked her, the best of your technology, with everything going over once and going over twice, you weren't able to develop any interpretable evidence as it relates to the clippings on the left side. To another lab to do a do-over or another go-round. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later, because she also had the opportunity to deal with the Clippers. One in 1.6 million Caucasians. Those are the numbers. Well, I don't have any qualms with those numbers. I don't have any qualms with those numbers because, first of all, it doesn't tell you where it came from, number one. Number two, keep in mind, she didn't do any testing on the Clippers. Why? Why? The phenolphthalein test you've heard from Paulina Bertos is used to find the presence of blood. Especially blood that, you know what, you can't see. But what ends up happening is that she doesn't see a red blood stain, she doesn't see a red-brown stain on the Clippers, so she doesn't swab them. So therefore, we're in a situation where we don't know where the DNA came from. We don't know if it's blood or if it's skin cells. And it really doesn't matter. I point that out to you only because you're talking about protocol, you're talking about testing, you're talking about science, and you're talking about relying on numbers. So when you do that, you want to make sure you're doing everything you can. But you know what? It doesn't really matter, because essentially what we find out is that Stephen Tomlinson's DNA is on those gloves, on those Clippers. But the only problem with that, for your consideration when you decide whether or not this is a piece of evidence that means anything to you, is that the gloves with the blood and the DNA of Stephen Tomlinson are in the same pocket with the Clippers. They're wadded up all together in the pocket. The Deputy Perez tells you they come out together, and each one of the DNA experts said, yes, it can transfer. Yes, there are transfer properties in blood and cells, no matter which they are. And again, I would suggest to you that it doesn't create any additional concern that there was Stephen Tomlinson's DNA in a pocket with gloves that had Stephen Tomlinson's blood and DNA on them. That's what Amy Rockhold told you. And that was Amy Rockhold's testimony. We then heard from Cassie Johnson, who has some significant experience in DNA. She is from Cellmark, which is in Dallas, a private lab, an outsource. Many times when FDLE can't do something, or FDLE is, at a dead end, or something else needs to be done. And in fact, what happens is Amy Rockhold sends the nail clipping extracts, okay, not the nail clippings, but the extracts to Cassie Johnson. And she essentially is Amy Rockhold's safety net for these clippings. And again, remember, the right-hand clipping was only Stephen Tomlinson, showing a profile only for himself. And ladies and gentlemen, ask yourself if Stephen Tomlinson was struggling and fighting for his life, and we're not talking about being shot in the head or stabbed in the heart or beat over the back of the head with a bat. We know it was a dynamic situation as set forth by numerous different people. Why was there no DNA on Stephen Tomlinson's hands and fingers? Now, I stepped away a little bit from the clippings, but now I'm talking about his hands and his fingers. The one and most probable source of everything that he could do to stay alive rests in his hands and arms. Now, I don't want to limit the possibility of his feet and his legs, but certainly that is the most common means of defending yourself, especially in a situation like this. Whether it be from behind, whether it be from here, whether it be in any situation. Why is there no DNA on his hands and his fingers? DNA is some spectacular stuff. I don't think we can rise and fall with it, as I believe I'm proving to you and will continue to show you based on the evidence. But the bottom line is, it's some powerful stuff. Why wouldn't Josh Rosa's DNA be on the victim's primary means to defend himself or to create any viewable, credible injuries on Josh Rosa? Again, he wasn't knocked unconscious. He wasn't stabbed in a vital organ. He wasn't shot. So Cassie Johnson does her testing. And what Cassie Johnson tells us is that when you do YSDR, you're going to have 17 markers, 17 different places where they look. Okay? And what she tells you is that she got information consistent with Stephen Tomlinson at those markers, and she only got information that can exclude Joshua Rosa at 3 of the 17 markers. And this is DNA, people. We're not talking about 3 minivans. We're not talking about 3 tractor trailers. We're talking about 3 areas of DNA out of 17. And I anticipate the state's going to tell you, well, if there were more, if there was more DNA, there may be, more places, and, we had limited quantities. Well, we had what we had. And they tested what they had. And you know what the result was? The result was, very simply, that the way this works is that you have several populations and several ethnic groups. And those ethnic groups are set forth in a database. And you put that sample in and you punch a number, and it's going to give you a number based on that particular ethnic group. But what it doesn't tell you, what science doesn't tell you unless you ask, is that it doesn't tell you what the ethnic group is of the contributor. Okay? So the bottom line is, you heard Cassie Johnson say that essentially all this does is not exclude Josh Rosa of being a person that could have contributed to that sample. But what makes that even more startling, as you consider it in your deliberations, is look at the report. And we talked about the report. The report is essentially that if you were the contributor to this sample under Stephen Tomlinson's fingernails, and you weren't Josh Rosa, you were an African American. If you were an African American, it would be 1 in 5. So every 1 in 5 African Americans, as it relates to that database, would have similar DNA pattern and wouldn't be excluded. If you were a Caucasian and you happen to be the contributor to that DNA sample, then it would be 1 and 20. And I don't know, not in jest, but certainly out of curiosity, I asked Ms. Johnson, well, you know, how many African Americans did you pass since you got out of the car? Because more than likely she would have passed enough to where one of them could have been the contributor to this unknown sample. And as it relates to Hispanics, it would be 1 in 12. So if there were 12 Hispanics sitting in this box, one of them could also have the same potential profile as the person that left that DNA under or on Stephen Tomlinson's clippings. And Cassie Johnson, I believe, showed us the very reason why we should be so concerned with scientific evidence. Because if you know what you're doing, you can't be blinded by the light. You can't be blinded by the light and blinded by the numbers. So don't be blinded. This is not Joshua Rose's DNA on that fingernail clipping. It's no more Joshua Rose's DNA on that fingernail clipping than every 12th Hispanic that you will pass when you leave this courtroom. Cassie Johnson used the word Joshua Rosa can't be excluded so many times that I stopped writing it down on my paper. I just stopped. I said, how many times can you say somebody can't be excluded? But you know what? This is not CSI. This is not Law and Order. And it's everyday interaction between people that know each other. And do you know what can't exclude, he can't be excluded is? That's reasonable doubt. That's what he can't be excluded means. I couldn't have put it as it relates to that evidence any better. If you can't be excluded, then you have reasonable doubt. Paulina Bernos, and I just hearkened back to her for a minute, said DNA gives value and weight to the evidence. And you need to look closely at what this DNA evidence really gives you in terms of value and in terms of weight. Finally, from a scientific standpoint, we heard from Scott Henderson. You know where I'm at? Yeah. That's what I have on.
We'll break it too.
Finally, from a scientific standpoint, we heard from Scott Henderson, and he is a blood stain analyst, the final expert in our common sense case. And Scott Henderson said several things that are important. Number one, he saw no staining, and there ultimately was no staining in the black tank top. We had the gloves up, if you recall. They're not up in the same form and fashion, but I would suggest you do that when you get into the room to deliberate. Take a look at what they tell you. Almost all of the staining. Now, I had to ask him, and that concerns me, to define a wipe, because we defined a contact, we defined a swipe, we defined a drop, we defined an impact splatter. The only thing we didn't define was a common term used every day in blood stain analysis, and that's a wipe. And Scott Henderson said that many of the stains on those gloves are consistent with wipes. Someone removing blood from a surface. That's what he said. Plain and simple. Many of those stains, he said, were a mixture of wipes and swipes. So use the word wipe, because the word wipe is important in this case. He also said that much of the staining that you may see in those gloves may be from the fact that they were folded, or they were wadded, or they were in a pocket. And he certainly said that blood in those circumstances, number one, transfers, and number two, you'll see, you don't need an expert to tell you that if you put blood on that glove with that fabric, it's going right through. It's going right through, and it's going to end up on Joshua Rose's hand. By the way, look at it, compare it, blood goes on the hand because the hand was used to wipe. If you can go home and you can sleep after this is all over, then you don't have a reasonable doubt. In closing, remember that it's not if you believe Joshua Rosa might be guilty. It's not Joshua Rosa might be guilty. It's not Joshua Rosa probably is guilty or possibly he's guilty. That's not enough. If you're pretty sure, it's not enough, and that's the essence of reasonable doubt. You know, the system brings us here, and for the last week, it brings us together in a very strange way. You know, we summoned you to judge somebody else, and we summoned you to leave your home and your jobs and your businesses and your families, but the system also provides you with a safeguard, and that's reasonable doubt and the presumption of innocence, that Joshua Rosa is innocent. He need not prove anything to you. It is the state's entire burden to prove to you each and every element of the offense. The system also realizes this is a very frightening thing, and you'll spend a long time after this is over thinking about it, no matter what your verdict is. I do believe, though, and understand that this will be my last opportunity to speak to you. Mr. Pruner will be able to come back and talk to you a little bit more about the evidence. I do believe that after you look through everything that's been provided to you and you recall the testimony that has gone on this week, and you apply the law to those facts, that you will have no problem in returning a verdict of not guilty against Joshua Rosa. Just remember that the last word is not always the most credible word. Thank you.